Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in ENO's latest webinar. I'm Brianne Eby, a Senior Policy Analyst at ENO, and I'm thrilled about today's webinar on the very important topic of environmental justice, or injustice in this case, and how the topic relates to transportation. This is an idea that often, I think, gets lost in the broader discussions about climate and the environment, and it's important to consider the historical context of environmental justice, how it relates to current events like COVID, and the potential future policies for environmental justice. Here today to walk us through some of this is Veronica McBeth, an associate planner at Kittelson Associates. Prior to her work at Kittelson, Veronica has a combined 14 years in the public sector at all levels of government, including with the U.S. Senate, the Maryland Department of Transportation, and the Maryland Transit Administration, as well as the Baltimore Department of Transportation. While she's speaking, you can submit questions using the questions function at any time. And we'll then go to about 15 minutes of Q&A, and of course you can submit questions at that point as well. Today's presentation will be available after the fact on ENO's website. And with that, I will turn it over to Veronica.
Thank you, Brianne. I'm looking forward to sharing a brief version of my presentation, so let's get started. I'm going to turn off my camera to get started with this, and then we will move forward with the presentation. As Brianne said at the end, we are going to move through the Q&A. So good afternoon. We're going to take a little bit of time and just talk about during these unprecedented times in history as it relates to a worldwide pandemic. And I'm going to share with you some thoughts on environmental justice, NEPA, Title VI, as it relates and often affects people of color. I have a condensed presentation here to give us some time to discuss the commentary. And as again, Brianne said, she'll talk to you and you can provide her questions at the end. So here we go. Just a quick look at overview and terms. We're going to talk about NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, Title VI as it relates to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, EJ, which is environmental justice, executive orders, and the Federal Highway Administration. The overview includes history of EJ, and you can just kind of read through it. NEPA, which was established on January 1st in 1970, and to date, more than 100 nations have enacted national environmental policies modeled after the United States NEPA policy. And environmental justice emerged as a concept in the early 1980s and was a movement that was started by individuals, actually primarily people of color, who sought to address the inequity of environmental protection in their communities. Often confused with environmental preservation and actually naturalism, which dates back to the mid-1850s with well-knowns like John Muir of the Sierra Club, or Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, or even Aldo Leopold, who wrote a Sand County Almanac. So the abstract and problem. Essentially, government implementation of both NEPA and Title VI have just not adequately addressed environmental justice concerns for people of color in America. Environmental justice affected groups also includes other minorities, low-income, rural, and tribal populations. The common subgroups of these populations include and overlap, including essentially and acting as a doubly negative impacted subset of these EJ affected groups. So the concentration that we see of polluters will include commercial, industrial, municipal, and even transportation pollution. And in these affected groups, communities have disproportionate exposure to harmful elements that will disparately impact their health and living environments and just general life functions. So we're going to take an in-depth look at both NEPA and Title VI regulations and how they are used in relation to environmental justice issues, specifically focusing on how low-income or people of color as the subgroup most negatively and disparately affected by EJ issues are treated. And it's more so as guidelines and goals and recommendations instead of NEPA actually being utilized as NEPA and Title VI actually being utilized as laws and regulations that actually have statutory language to support the enforcement of the laws. And I'm just going to let you take a moment and take a look at what NEPA means and the purposes of the Act. Next slide. So the next slide is going to tell you about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Next slide is Title VI. And with Title VI, I'm going to speak a little more specifically about equity in transportation. So equity in transportation seeks fairness in mobility and accessibility to meet the needs of all community members. A central goal of transportation equity is to facilitate social and economic opportunities by providing equitable levels of access to affordable and reliable transportation options based on the needs of the populations being served, particularly populations that are traditionally underserved. So this population group includes individuals in at least one of the following categories. Again, limited income, minority, elderly, children, limited English proficiency, or persons with disabilities. It's important to note that transportation equity does not mean equality. An equitable transportation plan considers the circumstances impacting a community's mobility and connectivity needs, and this information is used to determine the measures needed to develop an equitable transportation network. So to attain an equitable transportation network, all components of Title VI, environmental justice, and non-discrimination must be considered, and that includes anti-racism planning as well. Next slide. And taking a look at environmental justice as far as its definitions and history, the concept of environmental justice was further developed during the 1980s as the Civil Rights Restoration Act of 1987. And it was a clarification within the intent of Title VI. So this was to include all programs and activities of federal aid recipients, subrecipients, and even contractors, whether they were receiving federally funded contracts or not. So in '92, responding to the growing attention of environmental justice, the EPA went on to establish the Office of Environmental Equity. And as it went on, they went on further to establish the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Next slide. And then just taking a look at the history from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Again, the 60s showing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In the 70s, the Public Health Service acknowledged that there was inequality in areas where there were disproportionate amounts of African Americans and Hispanic children that were being impacted by pollution and industrialized areas. In the 80s, Warren County was kind of the central area that kind of provided, I guess, a protest point, so to speak, for hazardous waste and landfills. And then moving into the next slide, into the 80s, where the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice further put forward reports showing that toxic waste and issues were more prevalent in areas where there were people of color. In the 90s, the EPA established again, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and they developed the Title VI case study report to accompany this. Next slide. In 1994, Bill Clinton signed the Executive Order 12898. This order was basically to provide federal agencies the guidance to specifically look at disparate populations. And the goal was to identify programs, policies, and activities that specifically supported environmental justice. Next slide. So during this time, the White House Council on Environmental Quality was created, and there were guidance documents that were specifically associated with this, and they documented 6 principles that would help you navigate and analyze the environmental justice issues that were associated with the council. We'll go over those guiding principles later in the presentation. Next slide. So as you move into the 2000s and 2010s, there were plans that were created by the EPA. And one particular plan was EJ 2014, which supported community-based action programs that would thought to better inform access, coordination, and leveraging within government agencies, specifically agencies like the U.S. Department of Transportation. Also, there were other plans that were known as EJ 2020, which was a strategic plan that would continue to move forward plans of the past that would focus on years 2016 and 2020. And we'll talk a little bit about in the upcoming slides how notably as years 2016 and 2020 have passed, things have essentially been at a standstill, and there are obviously some political ramifications that have been associated why things have been in the place that they are in at this point in time. So during the EJ 2020 plan, the goal was for the agency to focus on its attention on the environmental and public health issues and challenges that confronted the nation's minorities, low-income, tribal, and indigenous populations. This is important information to note because it kind of specifically will transition to future slides where we talk about COVID's influence on minority populations, specifically Black, Indigenous, and people of color. EJ 2020 consisted of 8 priority areas and 4 significant national environmental justice challenges. And the plan for the agencies to achieve them would really be trying to measure how the success of those plans would go. And the EPA expected periodic reviews and looked to appropriately revise those plans and the actions would undertake to meet these goals and plans. And every national program and region has would assume the responsibility of co-leading at least one of those plans, priority areas, leaderships, and include in each section. However, obviously, there has been a significant standstill at the Environmental Protection Agency. Notably, if anybody has visited the website, it's been inactive for several years. And so we can see that there have been some challenges as we move through environmental justice or Title VI or even NEPA issues at this time. Next slide. So as it relates to Executive Order 12898 and how it addressed environmental justice and NEPA issues, there have been expectations of how it was supposed to deal with the adverse human and health and environmental effects, but in fact, at this state in time, it has been kind of rendered ineffective in some issues in some ways due to a new executive order that was since put into place. So next slide. Before we go into the discussion of the other executive order that I'm referencing, we're going to take a little bit of time and talk about the Federal Highway Administration Title VI program coverage as it relates to the executive order 12898. So specifically, the memorandum that accompanied executive order 12898 from President Clinton, it dealt with addressing any adverse environmental effects for the communities that dealt with mitigation measures. And so to take a specific look, federal actions as it related to things like a categorical exclusion. So that basically meant that there were not any significant impacts in that particular community. And so each federal agency would adopt its own NEPA procedures to prepare for environmental assessments. If the agency determined that there were not any significant environmental impacts, they would have a finding of no significant impact and document that presents the reasons why the agency has concluded that. If the environmental assessment of a proposed federal action would be significant, there would have to be an environmental impact statement, and that would have to be put forward, and necessary regulatory requirements for the environmental impact statement would have to be detailed in an environmental assessment. And then ultimately, the environmental impact statement ends with the issuance of a record of decision, which essentially explains the agency's decision, and it goes on record with the federal government and has to essentially undergo approval by the federal government. Next slide. Now, I mentioned that there was a subsequent executive order, and this subsequent executive order was issued by President Trump, and that is Executive Order 13807. And this by authority of establishing discipline and accountability in the environmental review and permitting process for infrastructure projects. And so this particular executive order has taken several very significant steps to deregulate the NEPA process. So if you were to access this executive order by taking a look at it, Googling it, or whatever you'd want to do, if you specifically go to Section 5 of this executive order, it discusses the process of enhancements that basically deregulate how the NEPA process should work for major infrastructure projects, so specifically transportation projects, to help speed along the agency decision by issuing one federal decision. So typically when you have a major infrastructure project, and I will give you the example of a project that I worked on, say the Baltimore and Potomac Tunnel Project, which was a tunnel project that would build a new tunnel for the Northeast region tunnel that connected Amtrak and commuter train services through the Northeast corridor. And this was because the useful life of the existing tunnel was no longer viable. And this NEPA review took 2 years. This one federal decision process could essentially cut the time in half or less for a one federal decision process, basically not taking the proper steps to do a full-on NEPA process for the project. And it further empowers the Council of Environmental Quality to create the framework for what one federal decision it means. And it would make it a very subjective process and not allowing the experts to dictate and determine how the appropriate steps would need to be taken for an environmental policy review. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier the 6 guiding principles that would be associated with NEPA. And so One would be considering the composition of the affected area to determine whether the low income minority or tribal populations are represented. And here, and whether there may be disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental or health effects for that population. And then two, in the affected population, as well as the historical patterns of exposure to environmental hazards. And so that's basically just considering the relevant public health and industry data that there is for the potential of exposure for the human health or environmental hazards. The third thing is that could these things amplify the natural and physical environmental effects of those proposed actions? So next slide. And then we want to develop effective public participation strategies, assure meaningful community representation in the process, and begin at the earliest stages. Oftentimes, people in communities are brought in when it's too late, and we want to bring people in and be transparent at the beginning. And then the last thing is to seek tribal representation in the process. Next slide. So the critical thing I wanted to include in this is to talk about what's happening right now. So COVID-19 and the impacts on minority populations. According to the CDC, the main factors that contribute to increased risks as it relates to the inequities of social determinants of health that put racial and ethnic minority groups at an increased risk of getting sick and actually dying from COVID include discrimination, the lack of healthcare access and utilization, occupations and typically being essential employees or blue collar workers, educational, income and wealth gaps, housing, transportation disparities, and even telecommuting disparities. According to the UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies, some of the big issues associated with problems with the COVID-19 pandemic include mobility, social distancing, and people working from home. Travel has decreased significantly. However, for those who are impacted by being blue collar employees, they don't have the option to work from home, which means that they have to continue to use public transportation, or worse, they have either been furloughed or lost their jobs. So for people who are in white collar industries or who have the opportunity to be or tend to be higher educated, there are disparities where 50% high income now telecommute due to COVID-19, where in low income have more likely reported their job loss during the pandemic. And telecommuting has remained unchanged or not an option, as I said, for the blue collar workers. And low income workers face socioeconomic disparities along with health impacts and other gap indicators. Next slide. It's also more difficult for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities to remain safe during the pandemic, since the virus mainly spreads from person to person. And typically, and as stated by the CDC, the best way to prevent contracting COVID is appropriate social distancing. However, it's extremely hard to social distance. And it's a privilege that many people of color cannot afford because they make up the majority of essential workers. They are generally less able to work from home. Even if these workers could stay home, they may be more likely to live in densely populated areas, reside in multi-generational or multi-family households. And so it's really difficult to follow social distancing recommendations. And the data that's shown as it relates to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, that they're more likely dependent upon public transportation and live in areas with a lack of access to grocery stores and even food deserts, which make it even more challenging to stock up on supplies to stay at home. And many communities, especially indigenous populations and territories such as Navajo Nation, even lack the access to clean water, making it difficult for hand washing. Next slide. And this is one of the last slides, and I will kind of cut this a bit short, but this is actually work that we've done here in Baltimore City at my firm, and I will quickly zip through this. This bottom left slide shows our work with the scooter share system here in Baltimore, and it shows the equity zones here in Baltimore. And basically, after the emergence of COVID, it shows the total trips originating from our equity zones had decreased, but the percentage of the trips originating from the equity zones compared to the total trips in the city had actually increased. And then if we look up at the slide on the top right, it illustrates the proportion of daily rides that began and ended at hospitals, food distribution sites, or even grocery stores. And with the total proportion of daily rides that began or ended at any of these same essential services had increased from 1/5 in early March to 1/3 after the emergence of COVID. So you see a significant increase if you follow the green line on the graph. Next slide. I'm going to skip this, but feel free when you go back through the presentation, you can take a look at this refinery rule slide. Next slide. Quickly, legal issues and challenges. There are significant legal issues and challenges as you move through and navigate environmental justice issues. And as we see, it's very difficult to prove in court. One of the things that we're seeing, and it's taking a very long time to navigate, are environmental justice lawsuits. And one of the ones that we have notably seen that has proven challenging but is reaping results are the Flint, Michigan water crisis, civil and criminal litigation. But otherwise, if you go through kind of case law, it's a very difficult and challenging thing to prove and navigate in the legal realm. Next slide. So what's next? What do we ask? What do you do as a proponent for environmental justice? Do you practice these tenets in your work, in your personal life, in your professional life? What do you do in your projects to help make sure that environmental justice is forward facing? And making sure that as you look forward, that federal agencies are continuing to expand upon the guidelines associated with environmental justice. What kind of outreach efforts, what kind of consistent financial assistance are we mapping? Is there tribal assistance, enforcement, targeted training, accountability, community engagement, and even performance metrics? So I'm asking, what's next? And that is the end. So looking forward to any questions. And Brianne.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Veronica. Sure. And we've had a few questions come in already, but if folks want to continue submitting those, we'll be going through those. I think we have about 15 minutes now for Q&A. So a bunch of them come in already. The first one, Veronica, is I think points back to the guiding principles that you discussed. And so in terms of determining the composition of an affected area, can you talk through what some of the ways of defining affected areas are, and what are the data that are used to determine what an affected area is? Is that assessment something that's carried out using federal or local or MPO level data? How is that determined?
Yes. So I would say an affected area is determined by places and people. So places being rural areas, low income, minority, tribal, and even disabled groups. But it's also determined by federal and local standing. So federal in the sense that you're getting census data, so maybe block groups and things like that. But when you're breaking down block groups and things, you're looking at locality. So what you're also wanting to know is where the project is going, right? So you're not going to limit yourself to only look at census data and at the federal level. So if it's going down the street from your house, you're going to go and dig, and you're going to look at, you're going to specifically take a look at and focus on the local population, the residents, You're going to reach out to the community groups, the organizers, and associations, and you're going to do it early and often, right? You're going to aid with connecting locals directly to the policymakers and agency officials and liaisons, and create an inviting atmosphere for the members to attend, and consider times of meetings, the locations. If you can help feed the people that are coming to the meetings, provide childcare, and even the accessibility of the meetings, whether it's making sure that you have an ADA compliant location, whether it's a central location, whether it's a large enough project that you even have to consider having multiple meetings of the same meeting in different quadrants of the area. So it's meeting people where they are, really.
That's great. And actually, just to follow up to that, a couple of questions about what does public participation look like specifically in this COVID era? That's something that we've all kind of had to really shift a lot of those processes. And so what does that look like now? Have you seen any examples of best practices for public participation and engagement during COVID?
I have. I've seen some really innovative things. I have seen virtual meetings. I think what we have found out is that we are living in a virtual world, and at the very least, even low-income populations, you're seeing that they do, in some caveat or some capacity, have access to the internet. So people are utilizing their phones a lot more. People are able to get on some kind of Zoom meeting. So you don't necessarily have to be visible virtually, but you can dial into a meeting. People are still doing public engagement meetings. I have several former colleagues who work for Baltimore City that are still engaging in public outreach and public meetings. They're not meeting inside of places, but they're actually meeting outside in the communities where the projects are going on, and they're socially distancing. So they are still having public engagement. People are coordinating via email and things like that. People are having phone calls. So you're kind of relegated to going back to your past a little bit, and playing phone line a little bit. So I would say that's definitely one of the things I'm seeing. But I would also say that it's still very integral that you're making it transparent. So you just have to do a little more legwork. That's all. So you have to literally pound the pavement a little bit more than you did. And it's your job. So that's what we have to do. And it's our job. And I'm not saying your job as a public servant, but it's our job to do that.
That's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This next one's really interesting. So somebody asked if a local government, or I'm assuming this also pertains to transit agencies, is looking to go beyond non-discrimination categories to apply a more detailed equity lens to transportation, what factors should be considered? And I'm thinking also, how does justice, really play a role in here? So how can we go beyond just non-discrimination?
I think that's a great question. And I think it's kind of a very self-reflective question. I feel like the challenge that you face is that people are very uncomfortable with these type of conversations. I think it's an anti-racism question. I think it's not just looking at the categories that are dictated as affected people. I think they don't even fully categorize everybody that are impacted when you're doing project work, right? Like, I think you're missing a lot of people when you're doing that type of work. What I would say is that I think it's about lobbying of sorts. You know what I mean? I think it goes to lobbying your local officials about changing local government and perhaps starting there. I don't think it's something that, unfortunately, you're going to be able to go to your local DOT and say, hey, you're not doing your job right, because what they're going to tell you is I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, as it says in, my local government jurisdictions. I'm doing what it says to me at the state government level, and I'm doing what it says at the federal government level. But what you can do is lobby to make changes to the laws. And it also means, though, that you can hold yourselves to higher standards, right? There are local governments who handle federal laws, but then hold themselves to even higher standards. You know what I mean? So I think you can handle things that way.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we've had a few questions come in specifically about the role that community engagement plays in the NEPA process and what that looks like for transportation project delivery, whether it's building highways or transit projects. So there's an ongoing discussion about streamlining NEPA to help speed up project delivery. Something that I've heard, and somebody else remarked on something like this too, is that it's necessary to involve the community as early on as possible in planning, projects like transit projects, in order to avoid potential litigation that might eventually delay those projects from being delivered.
Right.
Does this track with what you know about NEPA and community engagement, and are there best practices for making sure that community voices are heard while also continuing to deliver transit projects that can have environmental benefits?
Right. So I think that it's very critical to involve the communities early and often, right? So I think that when you are planning, I think when you are dreaming up ideas, I think it's too important to engage the community. I think oftentimes as planners and engineers, there's a level of arrogance that we think we know better than what we do. And we don't always live there. I'm lucky enough to live where I work, but it's not always the case, right? I work on national projects, so I don't always live where I work. I try to get involved in that in the areas where I work, but specifically to Baltimore, I would use the BMP tunnel project. So I live where I work. I spent 2 years on this NEPA project from start to finish. I helped host well over 24 community engagement meetings, because if one wasn't enough, 20 wasn't enough. And as many as the community needed, they were going to have. We had the same meeting sometimes. It felt like Groundhog's Day, but it didn't matter, because if one doesn't understand, we want everybody to understand. And so making sure that you're involving the communities early and often, making sure you're talking to people in languages they understand, and making sure that we listened and listened and listened again. Communities have a right to tell you what their concerns are, and we are responsible to ensuring that we are not destroying communities. In listening to them, what they said, we actually ended up utilizing an alternative design that helped the community, one, with a mitigation effort that took us back to the drawing board to readdress, put in an alternative that, because of the impacts, would have harmed the community, would have harmed local businesses, and despite not being the most cost-effective option, in the end, it made the neighborhood happy, it made the local officials happy, and also on the record of decision, it allowed them $50 million in mitigation. That meant that despite us also addressing an impact and alternative, we still wanted to make sure that the community received and got what they deserve. So I think you need to make sure that communities have their say-so at all costs. You know what I mean? I don't think you can't have a win-win. Everybody can win, and sometimes I think we don't always see that as planners and engineers. We want what we want. And our clients want that too. And we want to please our clients, but sometimes it's okay to push back a little bit.
Got it, thank you. There's a question here about if you have thoughts on potential tools or a framework to implement equity and transportation infrastructure investments for regional organizations that maybe don't have a mandate to adhere to environmental justice or to Title VI orders.
So I would say I think it's really critical to work with experts in the industry. We at our firm right now, we are working with industry experts to help us kind of take a look at our internal efforts. And, you know, we don't know everything. We're learning and we're growing. And I think it's okay when you don't know everything, kind of acknowledging that it's okay to not know everything. And I would say working with industry experts, I think creating a budget to hire someone, whether it's a contractor, whether it's a full-time person for that position, to help facilitate and plan kind of your short-term, intermediate, and long-term agency goals. You could consider, if you have an MPO and there are multiple organizations that are local, consider sharing the costs, you know what I mean, with bringing somebody on board. And we've brought someone on board, and I know other agencies that are doing things like that. So that would be my recommendation. You know, like, I mean, you can look up resources. We've hired people for half-day presentations, professional organizations that I'm a member of. There are industrial psychologists who specialize in these particular areas. I mean, I think there are a number of ways that you can begin kind of shifting the narrative to be more eyes wide open about environmental justice and equity issues and things like that at MPOs, government agencies, all sorts of things.
Got it. Another COVID question here. So somebody is pointing to, you know, the fact that a lot of major cities are having to cut, you know, entire bus routes or you know, really cut back on their service because revenues are down and other, you know, there's just a lot of challenges with delivering service right now. If agencies were to obtain more funding, you know, whether that's from the federal government or other sources, do you see them applying an equity lens to help decide where to prioritize service improvements? And if not, maybe how can that, you know, be the outcome? How can we make sure that any service that's brought back is equitable?
I think they absolutely have to apply an equity lens. I don't even think it's an if. They must. They must apply an equity lens. I think more times than not, the people who are getting the short end of the stick are the people who are the low income populations, the people of color, you know, the disabled, the people who need transportation services the most. We just went through a situation here in Baltimore where there were proposed service cuts, and the mayor-elect that is coming in, you know, kind of rallied the proverbial troops to push back. There was almost a 50% service cut that was almost exclusively impacting minority populations, people who are essential workers, people who are 100% dependent on the bus service. You know, 30% of people who are in low income populations, 30%, and not 30% of people, but 30% of their income goes to transportation. And then you take that away, you don't have a way to get to work, which means that you don't have income. So it becomes this vicious cycle, you know, then you don't have a place to live. Then you don't have food to eat. There's already not food in your neighborhood. You know what I mean? So you have these systemic problems that continue to recreate themselves because there is not an investment in basic human needs. These are human needs. These are human rights. So absolutely, equity has to be considered when you are funding transit systems, especially during a time like COVID, more than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's unfortunately all the time that we have for today. We had a bunch of questions that we unfortunately could not get to. Veronica, your contact information is right there, so I suspect you might be getting some follow-ups. But thank you so much for your presentation. I think there was a ton of engagement, ton of interest in this, and you know, this is something that we want to continue to explore, and I hope this was useful for everyone. So thanks to Veronica and thanks to our listeners. Our next webinar, Transit Governance Reform, Examples from Baltimore, Minneapolis, and Boston, is going to be next Wednesday, December 16th. And as always, don't forget to sign up for Transportation Weekly for regular updates on our work and other transportation policy matters. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye.